afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Winter Park Library. How many of you are making your first visit to the Winter Park Library? Oh, it improves every day. Thank you. My name is Dr. Ruth Edwards. I'm Director of Education here at the library and also one of the members of the Smith Grant Selection Committee. And so this afternoon, we're very pleased to welcome Rick Kilby, who was this year's recipient and will be presenting his report on the murals of Winter Park. So help me welcome Rick Kilby.
Thank you. It's a real honor to have received the Smith Grant. We have at least 2 other Smith Grant recipients. If you're in the back, we have Kim Mould and Farrell Livingston, rock stars in Winter Park history, in my opinion. And it's an honor that they came out tonight. As I was doing my research, I kept coming across the work of other Smith Grant recipients. Rick Fogelsong, he did a piece that I used, and it's a great body of research. And to be able to contribute that is a huge honor, and it put a little bit of pressure on me, but motivated me to do my very best work. But a lot of people contributed. I went to a bunch of archives. There's nothing I'd rather do than dig through historical archives. They have a great one here. I want to give a big shout out to Rachel, Janessa, and Jeremy, who helped me with all this stuff here. But I also went to Rollins, and I went to UCF, and I went over to Tampa and found a lot of great stuff. One of the requirements was to have primary source material, so I did 12 oral histories, and there are people who did oral histories here tonight, including one of the artists, Al Cerverellera. I probably butchered your last name, and it's an honor to have him. And Joy Dickinson is here, and she helped me edit my work, and there's great people here, and it's just an honor, and I appreciate you guys coming out. So a little bit of background how I got interested in this topic. My obsession and the origins of my first book go back before 2009. I visited the Fountain Youth Attraction. Even more background, my brother can attest that my dad was a cheapskate who wouldn't let us go to cheesy tourist traps. And so I had to wait till when I was an adult to go to someplace like the Fountain of Youth. And when I went there, it was a life-changing experience. And one of the things I discovered was this incredible mural by an artist named Hollis Holbrook, who was in charge of the art department in the at least in the 50s. This mural dates back to the 50s, and I discovered this mural in an air-conditioned building, kind of exposed to the elements, and I thought, what is this magnificent piece of art here? And it kind of made it my mission to try and find other gems like this that hadn't been given enough exposure and to shed a light on them. And I think this was my very first historic mural of Florida that I became obsessed with. Other things that happened. So as a result of that trip to the Fountain of Youth, I started writing a blog, and these are some of the things I wrote about in 2009 in my early blogs. Well, first my wife gave me this beautiful print of the roseate spoonbills right there by the artist Joy Postal. And I got hyper obsessed with her and wrote multiple blogs about her. I hooked up with someone named Denise Hall. We traveled the state looking for her murals, and she created an archive at the University of Central Florida. So a lot of her work, her writings, and her photographs are now in the UCF archives. I also noticed in 2009 that they were working on the mural, the mosaic, on Pennsylvania Avenue, the Winter Park Day Nursery, and I was concerned, and I wrote them, and they wrote back and said, don't worry, it's not going to go away, we're restoring it. And thank God, because it's a wonderful piece that's included in my work tonight. I also got hyper obsessed with the work of Sam Stoltz. I went to a number of his properties around College Park and Mount Plymouth. This is a detail of one of his homes in Mount Plymouth. One of his murals is in my research as well. And then there was a big campaign by the National Trust called This Place Matters. And you would take a sign and go in front of a place that was threatened and take a photograph of yourself to draw more attention to that as a historic resource. And so at that point, the Winter Park Post Office was in danger of going away, so I went in front of the mural and did that. So I've been stewing on this information for years and not had an opportunity to do anything more with it. But then there was a lot of fortuitous events that happened to lead up to it. So how many people got to see this exhibit? Yay, well, if you didn't, this is your last chance. It closes in an hour, unfortunately, but I'm on the board of the Winter Park History Museum and was involved in the creation of this exhibit, and I wanted to contribute, so what I decided I would do is do a talk about murals, and several different things happened around that time. One of those was I had an opportunity to go see the Joy Postal mural at Rollins, which I had never seen before. Somehow in my mind, it was this small little picture of a ship that I found somewhere online, but that wasn't it at all. It was mind-blowing because it's this floor-to-ceiling image of larger-than-life flamingos tucked away in this tiny little building that you would never know was there. And to me, this was like the universe telling me there's more to this topic and you need to dig in. And I wanted to start, so what I've done is compiled a book of all my research. And what I started with this one because of the connection between Rollins and the aesthetic character of Winter Park. Because when the founders of Winter Park brought the college here, they were really, they knew it was important to have arts and cultures here in town. And so the college was a huge part of that, and I wanted to start the project off with that. It came about because of a shift in Rollins. Initially, when the college first started in the 1900s, the emphasis was on the French language. But eventually, in the 20th century, they started to shift away from French being taught to Spanish for several reasons. One, within the United States, there was a turning inward and realizing that the whole hemisphere needed to be taken care of for security reasons. After World War II, that was emphasized even more because there were Germans who were involved with Argentina, and there was a renewed emphasis going back to FDR to pay attention to North, Central, and South America all as one entity. So they started an Inter-American department, and they tasked A.J. Hanna with running that department. I had run across A.J. Hanna several times in my research. He also wrote a book about the St. Johns River. He's one of our legendary Florida state historians, and was very important in the history of Rollins during the Hamilton Holt era. Under him, they hired another professor who was Spanish, named Professor Angela Palomo Campbell, and the two of them developed this department on Rollins College campus. So initially it was housed in a building that had been a dormitory, this old wooden building, but they wanted a more permanent home. So this is one of my favorite stories that I came across. There was a private home owned by Mrs. Skinner right there on Holt Avenue, and she wanted to sell it to Rollins, and she wanted 15 grand. She wanted 10 grand in cash from Rollins, and then she wanted to get credit for a $5,000 donation. So the guy who was in charge of finance was W.R. O'Neill, who was a famous historian in Orlando circles. And he said, wait a minute, I don't think we can do this. I think the IRS is gonna call BS on us if we try and do this $5,000 gift thing. And so there was a series of letters in the Rollins College archives going back and forth. Can we do this? Should we do this? Should we do this? Meanwhile, A.J. Hanna is working behind the scenes, securing money to buy this house even before the Board of Trustees had approved the purchase of this house. So eventually they get $7,000 of the $10,000 in gifts, and they realize they can't give the money back, so they have to go ahead and proceed with the purchase of the home. As you can see, it's in a Spanish style that fits perfectly into the Rollins College campus. The scale is a little bit different. But they went ahead and bought it, and it's called Casa Iberia, or the Spanish house. So Professor Campbell was charged with coming up with the decor for inside the house. You can see it's very conservative. It looks like it might have been a house in Spain from that era. So the mural is a little bit different, and I was never able to find any concrete connection between Campbell and the artist Joy Postal, but I was able to find a connection with A.J. Hanna, so it's more likely that's how the mural came about. Oh, one other thing I learned, which was interesting to me, when they were furnishing the building later on, they got some of the furnishings from the Barber estate, and if you know, the Barber house is actually Casa Feliz. So some of the furnishings that were in Casa Iberia may have initially been in Casa Feliz. So this is a wonderful hand-tinted image of the courtyard. It's called the Cervantes Courtyard. It was landscaped by Mulford Foster, another famous Orlando artist in his own right. And if you can see right there, through that window, those are the flamingos. Not the best way to have artwork on display because the UV light would just destroy it eventually, but I think that was probably just for the photograph because now at least it's got big Venetian blinds in front of it. But this is a very early postcard. I love this chair. I would love to have this chair. Maybe somebody could date that. It's probably from the 40s maybe. It's lovely. Of course, the story I really wanted to tell most of all was the artist Joy Postal, because she is a fascinating character, born at the very end of the 19th century in Chicago. She went to the Art Institute of Chicago as a teenager. She was there at the same time Alvin Plasek was in charge of the sculpture department, and she was a larger-than-life character who's fascinating. Great picture of her, again, from the UCF archives. And the other thing that happened that was this incredible fortuitous event is I had this big yellow box sitting up in my attic in my office for years and had never opened it. And it was materials of Joy Postal's that I hadn't really looked at. And there were letters from her that was 5 feet away from me for years that I had never even explored. And it was wonderful, great primary source material, including this great photograph of her. This is what they called their little brownie house. They took a Model T and they built this little cabin on the back, and they traveled all over the United States and lived in it in Florida. Different times they would get evicted from a house, they'd move back into the brownie camper. Sometimes it was their studio. Everything they needed to live was in that little tiny house. So Joy graduated from Chicago from the Art Institute, and she and her brother and her mom moved to Idaho and bought a ranch. She taught art lessons and piano lessons and had this big, glorious ranching life. She worked with a decorator, did art, and she was interviewed by a reporter named Bob Blackstone. And Bob Blackstone was the love of her life, and they fell in love and got married a year later. And they took off. They left Idaho, and they just went exploring around the world, or around the country anyways, and until they were in Zion National Park, and her watercolors froze. And she said, it's time to head south. I can't do this anymore. It's just too cold. So they made this slow trip from the west across the United States, often stopping at these big hotels. So she did murals in Alabama, in Birmingham, in Beaumont, Texas. That's what this one photo is from. In Atlanta and in Pensacola. And there are stories that I was not able to verify that their strategy would be to run up a big bill at the hotel until they were forced to do murals because they had no other way to pay. I don't know if that's true, but I do know when she got a mural job, she stretched it out as long as possible. Could you imagine a luxury hotel or living in this tiny little camper? What's going to be better? So she and her husband would stretch it out. They would paint every surface they could imaginable. And she loved painting murals. Her father was an architect. She said, you have to understand space in order to paint a mural. And she painted murals up into her 80s. She was painting murals. And so 2 different time periods in her life. Here she is as a young woman in Texas. And this is in Florida, probably in the 50s or 60s, I'm guessing. So the one at Rollins was painted in 1945. I don't think I said that. They got to Florida permanently in 1933. They were in Pensacola in 32. But one of the things that UCF has that's incredible to explore is her diary from the early 30s to the late 30s. So it's like going back and seeing the world through the eyes of an artist living through the Depression. So some days they would find a turtle, and they were happy to find a turtle because they had something to eat. They were living off the land. They would raise chickens, sell them at restaurants. They had a very hard life. She would do art lessons all around north central Florida. Their headquarters was on Lake Catherine, which is in the Ocala National Forest, kind of between the town of Ocklawaha and Silver Springs. So her world was little towns like Citra and Ocala and Hawthorne. And she would do art lessons and piano lessons, and that's how she got by. But she was a real Florida woman. You can see that's about as Florida woman holding a sharp as you can get right there. But they had this great idea. So she used to travel around doing these lessons and everything, but they wanted to break into a higher paying audience. So they came up with this idea, she and her husband, doing this act called Glamour Birds. And so in this act, she would sing, her husband would play piano, and she would draw the birds. So the place they lived in the Ocala National Forest was a rookery, and she would spend hours just observing the birds. Eventually they went to the Keys and to the Everglades, and they saw more rookeries, and this was her big inspiration in her life, were these glamour birds, the big wading birds that you would see all across Florida, and these giant rookeries like we don't have anymore. And she would do these wonderful acts all across Florida and all across the Southeast that she called glamour birds. So this brochure is from 1944, which is about the time she painted the mural at Rollins. And what I love about this photograph, she's just as cute as could be with a little pixie cut. But if you notice, her dress and her painting all match. And so she was very detail oriented. When she did these, she had a great variety of merchandise she sold. She had postcards, greeting cards, little printed 11 by 17 posters. She would come back and paint on the 11 by 17 posters. She would do the paintings live or the drawings live and then sell them. She had a whole operation, and she would do it all over town. And so that's the first connection I found to Winter Park and to A.J. Hanna. So you can see 1945, so this would be slightly after she painted the mural. A.J. Hanna right here urges those who love wildlife and appreciate a creative talent to see and hear this program. That was a program that was in Annie Russell. And then she performed for the Women's Club right here. And again, A.J. Hanna has a big testimonial. And this is a piece of her promotional material that you can see. A.J. Hanna, who was president of the Audubon Society, did a testimonial. So they definitely had a link. So my guess is that's how she got the gig at Rollins, was through A.J. Hanna. So this is the mural as you see it. It's a hallway that's maybe 4 feet wide, so it's impossible to photograph the whole thing at once, so I had to stitch this together in Photoshop. But the flamingos are 4 or 5 feet high. What's different about this mural from her other murals is the way she treated the background. It's really just kind of a pastel blue. Normally she does a whole kind of 3D view of the mural. It's a spectacular piece of art, but it's not accessible to the public. It's kind of hidden away in this little building on the Rollins College campus. And oh my God, it was an incredible moment when I got to see it for the first time. So here it is. There's a interpretive sign there that said it was painted in 44, but she signed it in 1945. And I put this quote up here because, if you know what's going on in the world of art in the mid-40s, abstract expressionism is what's hot. It's starting to develop in New York. And Joy Postal was aware of that, but she turned her back to it. She said the biggest inspiration is nature, and that's it for me. I start abstract, but I get more in tune with nature, and that was always her inspiration. More Winter Park connections. So if you're familiar with the Seminole Hotel, there was 2 Seminole hotels. The early one burned down in the early 1900s, and then they replaced it with one on Lake Osceola. In 1964, the year I was born, she painted murals of Seminole women in there, and then there's some of birds. Unfortunately, that hotel's not here anymore. And this is her doing her Glamour Birds act in 1965, 20 years after she finished the mural at Rollins. So tragedy struck Joy Postal in 1968. The house she lived in Western Orange County caught on fire. Her husband died, and she was badly injured. She wrote a whole account that I had in that box that I'd never looked at before, talking about the horrors of not being able to close her eyes because her eyelids burned off. And she had tons of plastic surgery, and from then on, you notice she's probably wearing a wig in most of the pictures. But her friends rallied around her. They did fundraisers to help her, and she started painting again. I think my guess is this is her painting a mural in Fashion Square Mall. She painted it when she was 80 years old up on that easel. So she was remarkable. Eventually, she broke her hip and went to live in a nursing home, and she died at the age of 93 in 1989. But what's interesting to me is, like, when she was in art school, women couldn't even vote. And she was the primary breadwinner for her and her husband through those times during the Depression. So during my research on this and other murals, I kept finding these remarkable women, and that's one of the themes that carries forward again and again and again. She was honored in 2024 recently at the Pulaski because of her relationship with Alvin Pulaski. UCF honored her because they have the big collection, and they're going to do so again in a couple of years. And so she's well known locally. I hope that more and more people learn about Joy because she's a remarkable individual. So the next fortuitous thing happened. The Winter Park History Museum got a call from somebody, and they were remodeling their house, and there was a mirror over the fireplace, and they pulled it down and they pulled away our drywall. And lo and behold, there was this wonderful mural Beneath the Mirror, and it was done by the artist Sam Stoltz, which is one of those people I was also hyper obsessed with. And I got to go out there and visit it, and I've done talks about Sam Stoltz. I did a talk recently about Casa Feliz in 1933, and I talked about the big Florida land boom, and I tie Sam Stoltz's story to the Florida land boom because he arrived in 1926 in Winter Park at the height of the land boom. I'm sorry, not Winter Park. He was originally in College Park and then later moved to Winter Park. So, you know, property was going left and right, and Florida was exploding. In Winter Park, things that were originally citrus groves were being subdivided and becoming popular developments, and the city was booming. So Sam Stoltz moved here. He grew up again in the Midwest. He grew up in Nebraska. He studied art at Chicago. That's another thing I learned. There were a lot of Chicago influences in between the artists and different players in these murals. He went back to Nebraska, then back to Chicago, and eventually had his own art studio. And then he started building houses. He built his own house. I'm not sure this is actually a real house or a fantasy house, but a lot of the elements in this house you can see were done later. The fireplace made out of stone, the kind of Tudor style, English looking roof are things that he would do. When he was a commercial artist in the Midwest in Chicago, he got the moniker the world's greatest poultry painter. He did chickens well, you can see, but just look at how precisely painted they are, the detail. He was a brilliant draftsmanship, very, very tight penmanship. He arrived in Florida in 1926, and you know, what happened was that land boom was starting to peak in 1926, and Florida actually got in the Depression before the rest of the country because the bottom was falling out. So he had to do a lot of different things to survive. He did this mural for the Orlando Chamber of Commerce, this illustration for this brochure. That's his signature there in the corner. He did paintings for the Angel Hotel that's in downtown Orlando still. And he hooked up with a developer named Carl Dan, that's his signature right there. And they had this contest to name the houses that they were designing. And most of them were kind of storybook-looking cottages, like you said before. So they named the houses Plymouthian houses. And so this is a Plymouthian house designed by Sam Stoltz. And here's a bigger view of it. You can see it's kind of got British influence, but right here you can see some artwork that you can see like a flamingo and some wading birds. That was kind of his trademark. He would do these, I'll tell you about the style in a slide or two, but they were kind of three-dimensional bas-relief paintings of wading birds. And you may have seen this painting here. If anybody knows where the original is, that's one of the things I couldn't find. Nobody seems to know where it is. They have reproductions at Mead Gardens that they use for their anniversary, but nobody seems to know where the original is. But that's Theodore Mead, a beautiful painting. You can see how skilled an artist he was by that. So these are some of the homes he built. He started in College Park with Carl Dan, kind of Mediterranean revival style. He did these log cabin houses. This is the one that's near downtown Orlando. He did these kind of Tudor style things. He often used field stone for the chimney. And he did the exterior ornamenting on the front. You can see there's some here. This is probably the one in Mount Plymouth. This is his most famous house. This is the Whitmire house. And it's really faded here, but it's called the storybook style. And here's some of the interior details from those same houses. He loved to do work on the fireplace. You can see there the flamingos on either side of the fireplace. And I think flamingos were a common motif because it's that idea of Florida, that you want to move into this paradise, this wonderful place, and what personified that better, or what illustrated that better than a flamingo? So he loved to bust up the floor tile in different colors and make kind of a mosaic on the floor. Again, fieldstone fireplaces. This is a medallion that he did in his kind of three-dimensional bas-relief style. And again, this is exterior ornament. I think this has been touched up. The background probably was originally painted. But these are his signature paintings. Again, another flamingo. That's in a bathroom that was downtown that has been lost, sadly. So his whole technique was he would take the plaster while it was still wet and kind of form it with his fingers and then come back and paint on it. And he called it his plastic art style. And he, one of the differences I think between he and Joy Postal was he believed he was innovating. He was on the cutting edge, where Joy Postal was very traditional, where he felt like he was inventing something. And both artists worked really hard to promote themselves. And Joy had her husband helping to promote him. He was a big self-promoter, and so there were a lot of ads like this. Stoltz the artist, for something original, distinctive, and exclusive, dial 4858. So this is the house. It's on Summerlin Avenue. It's a couple houses down from where he lived, and I'll talk about that. But you can see the 2x4s are still in front of the wall where they discovered it originally. And here's some trademarks. This is what's left of his signature there. This is some fieldstone. This is some plaster. And here's his plastic art technique, you can see. I love the palette that he used. He tended to use a lot of pastel colors. And he believed that you've got too garish, it would take away from the subject matter. So a lot of his work is usually in that kind of subtle color palette. And you can see here, it needs cleaning really bad, it needs restoration, it's cracked, and it needs a whole lot of work. But the homeowners are very committed to restoring it. Originally they hired a decorator, and the decorator said, oh, we gotta lose this. And they're saying, no way. And so eventually their son will inherit the home, and their son is a big fisherman, so he's committed to keeping it too. So hopefully I will have pictures of it being restored someday in the near future. As for dating it, I'm guessing it came after the 1930, because this is an ad that Sam Stoltz took out in 1930. He said the artist formerly of Orlando has been lost for some time, but now he can be found in Winter Park on Summerlin Avenue. And he had the Summerlin kind of dead ends into a road. I can't remember what it's called, Dixie something, and it takes a left turn. That's where Sam Stoltz's property was. So this is just a couple houses down. So I'm guessing this ad was in 1930, so I'm guessing that's about the period of the mural. So the people who own the property also had a Sam Stoltz in their bathtub, and Sam loved to do that, but there could not be a worse place to do a mural than your bathtub because of the moisture. And some of his bathtubs, he would love to faux paint the walls, and some of them look so bad because it looks like it's all moldy and gross and disgusting. So this actually did have leak issues, and they had to tear it down, and so that no longer survives. So his home burned down in 1960. This is the exterior. You can see the kind of, I don't know what you call it, live edge siding. Here's Sam in his older age. His wife got dementia later in life, so he was taking care of her, and he unfortunately died before her. You can see this is one of his paintings in the background. One of the remarkable things that happened is, while I was working on this project, the Winter Park Library got the archives of his local historian named Grace Hagedorn. And so Grace had written and self-published a book about Sam Stoltz, so I got to go through all these files, file after file after file, and do a deep dive into Sam Stoltz stuff that maybe nobody else has ever seen before. So that was extremely exciting and helped my research quite a bit. So this has happened before. Sam Stoltz worked on Dub's Dread in Orlando, and they were restoring the clubhouse or the ballroom. And again, they found this wonderful Sam Stoltz work right underneath the 2x4s. And so they were able to keep, there were 4 in there, they were able to keep 2 of them, and they moved it to the College Park Neighborhood Center where it's on display today. Another theme throughout this is historic preservation and the importance of historic preservation, and I think this is a great example. When people see something that they deem worthy of preservation and they keep it. So the Winter Park Day Nursery, again, it meant something to me driving by all these years, but I learned a whole lot more, things that I didn't even know. The 6 murals in my study kind of fit together nicely. There's some from the mid to early 20th century that are related with art, but then there's 2 from the later part of the mid-century. So from 1960 to 1965, and those fit together because that was a big time of change in Winter Park history. And I see that as an opportunity for future historians to look more at that period. A lot of what's happening is outside the city center. You're seeing places like Aloma and Lee Road in 1792 start to boom. They call it the Miracle Mile or the Motel Mile because there's all these mom and pop motels along 1792. There's new shopping centers. And so people are starting to drift away from Park Avenue and go to these major roads because, for one thing, you can park there. And you start to see mid-century architecture where everything is traditional along Park Avenue, and you get to see this very mid-century looking building here, with a mural on the side. This is a rendering by Joseph Schifolo, or the architect was Joseph Schifolo. And one of the things that was significant that I didn't know at the time is that the Winter Park Day Nursery was originally called the White Day Nursery because it's a vestige of segregation. In the 1927, they started what was called the Colored Winter Park Day Nursery, and that was for workers who lived in the west side of Winter Park and came into Winter Park and worked for a place for their children to go to. The White Winter Park Day Nursery started in World War II when all the women were forced into the workplace in places like Gentile Brothers citrus packing plant, sometimes at the Orlando Army Air Base, or there was a parachute creating facility in Castleberry. So they had all these kids, and the principal at the school noticed that the older kids were having to take care of their younger siblings, so they started what was then called the White Winter Park Day Nursery in the late 1930s. So they built a building originally. It looks kind of like a house. It was designed by James Gamble Rogers II, and quickly outgrew it. So they built this new one in the 1959-1960. So this is the groundbreaking. The important people in this picture: Joseph Schifolo, the architect. This is the artist, Don Sill, who created the mosaic. And this is Jean Oliphant. She's another one of those rock star women I don't think we talk about enough, because she was in charge of the board for the Day Nursery, and she also had a lot to do with the Winter Park Art Festival, which I'll talk about soon. But the big connection is, and her husband was a city council member, but they owned a tile business. And so they were a big patron of Donald Sill, or Don Sill, the artist. And I think they hooked him up with tile, and they pushed him into being a mosaic artist. Because he came, again, he was a veteran from World War II. He came down from the Midwest, and he experimented with being a rancher, and he didn't like that, and truck farmer, and then he tried being a painter. But eventually he settled on mosaics, and that was his thing. And it's interesting, I couldn't find much about him. If anybody has a Don Sill piece, let me know. We're going to do an exhibit of these artists' work next year. And I know of one piece that we could put in there, and that's in the city's collection. I'll show you later. So the mosaic is really important. I think one thing, it exemplifies the values of kind of the 1950s when Winter Park was very kind of small town still, but on the cusp of big change. And one of the important things about this mural is it shows how a mural can become a landmark unto itself, where when you drive into Winter Park on Pennsylvania, this is like welcome to Winter Park when you see this sign. And another thing I think that I learned that was really important is that both these day nurseries survive today and are much beloved by the community. And I think I keep seeing again and again that the Winter Park community will take care of something they really believe in. And so these are still valuable resources for the community, both was the Colored Day Nursery, which is the Wellburn Nursery, and the Winter Park Day Nursery, which was originally called the White Day Nursery. So Don Sill, he's the mystery man, trying to find more. You know, I know he liked button-down shirts, and he was very preppy looking. His buddy here is Don Anderson. Don Anderson, right, Joy? Bob Anderson. He was the bohemian one. He had the kind of the Dobie Gillis goatee thing going. But he was very conservative, and this is from the Winter Park City Art Collection, this raku vessel. It's the only piece I can find of him. So there's more out there. The other piece I know that he did for sure is his buddy Nick Nichols owned the Barbizon restaurant, and they did this thing in the back called the Circus Room. And he did this mosaic of this creepy 6-foot clown. You can see it's in the background of a lot of pictures, and that's one of Don Sill's mosaic. Those are the only 3 pieces I could find anywhere. I know he did ceramics. I know he did more sculpture. There is a Don Sill who was in Atlanta and won a bunch of awards. There's a Don Sill in California and a Don Sill in Maine. I'm not sure if they're the same artist or not. I would love to know more. Someday I'll find more. But his biggest influence is he was in the room when they decided to start the Sidewalk Art Festival. So here he is. This is Nick Nichols here. This is Bob Anderson. And this is our buddy, Jean Oliphant. She was a real mover and shaker. and very involved. I think that 3 men came up with the idea, and they got her to run the whole thing for the first few years. So the Barbizon was where this all happened. That's where the hangout was. Supposedly, Nick Nichols, who was an artist, owned the Barbizon. He would hang artwork on the wall, and if you wanted to buy something, you just paid the cashier and walked out with the painting. So it was a whole little art community in that hidden garden area in the Barbizon restaurant right there. And that's kind of the center of everything. And so when you research Don Sill, that's what you're going to find out, is the stuff about the Sidewalk Art Festival. So here they are again. He's kind of in the gutter there, so he's not looking again. And this is Jeanette McCain. She exhibited during that very first Sidewalk Art Festival and kind of gave it the McCain stamp of approval, which is very important to ensure its survival. And what happened is, bringing the Sidewalk Art Festival to Winter Park made the art taste of the city more cosmopolitan. And it just kind of elevated everything. And there were galleries at the time, but something on that level, bringing in tens of thousands of people every year, just boosted the entire level and brought everyone's awareness to another peak, which ensured something like this could happen. So Joe Testa was a well-known artist who was kind of, if you compare this to the mural, The Big Bad Wolf, it's light years apart, but only 5 years different. And you can see it's the taste changed. So to contextualize this, I looked at things going on at the same time. So 1957, there is a movement to build this expressway coming across the state, which we now know is I-4, and it was going to come very close to downtown downtown Winter Park, and people were horrified. That's the original route right there. So they brought in a guy named Maurice Rodeval, and Rodeval was Hamilton Holt, Rollins College, Hamilton Holt's son-in-law. He was a famous city planner, known worldwide, and he suggested this route, which would go right across Lake Fairview, which, thank God it didn't, because the view at Hillstone would really be bad. But he also did things like, he wanted Morse Boulevard, there was all this growth on 1792 to be this beautiful kind of road lined with all these fancy shops and things like that. He kind of started the ball rolling on gentrification on the 1792. Because the city eventually took over some homes owned by African Americans close to 1792 through eminent domain, and that was all based on his ideas. The other thing that happened, so this was in 1956, the post office wants to close down the Winter Park post office. They want to combine it with Orlando. And so this picture is people at the city commission meeting saying, no way, we're against it. So there's a big protest. The mayor is Ray Green. He says no. And so there's so much pushback, they just decide not to. In fact, just a few years later, they decide to build a new Winter Park post office. So they find the site of the old Gentili Brothers post office, which was then Minute Maid, and then mostly sitting vacant at the time. And that's where they were going to build the post office. And when it opens in 1965, they call it the most modern post office in Central Florida. And one of the things they do that's exclusive to Winter Park is they use a special kind of brick, and they commission murals on 2 sides of it. And the muralist they chose is Joe Testa. He had won awards in the Sidewalk Art Show, and so is very well known. But he is a very important artist in Florida history. Again, he grew up in Tampa. He was drafted in the Korean conflict. He went to San Diego and found that he was good at drawing, and he became a medical illustrator at the Navy base there in San Diego. So the most interesting story is that he was making a drawing during an operation, and there was this large lamp that had a big counterweight, and they swung it around, and the counterweight whacked him in the side of the head, and he had this big gaping wound that just never seemed to heal. So eventually they examined it and found this big melanoma. And so, this being the late 1950s, they did this radical operation and amputated his ear. So you can see his jaw is a little disformed. He's always photographed with the one side of his face turned away, because you can't see him. I feel like this really drove him to really focus on his art, because of all the artists in the study, he was committed to a daily schedule of making art. You know, he kept regular office hours in his studio and just was committed to making art. So he came back to Tampa and he became a professor at the University of Tampa, eventually ended up running the art department there and retired there after 30 years, and he was well beloved. He was there at a very good time in the growth of Tampa, because USF was just starting and would get a major commission there. They did a retrospective of his work a few years ago, and you can see kind of the similarities between the post office murals. You can see a very similar palette. He always called his work figurative, even though it looks very abstract, and you can see, you know, where he's coming from in this. And this is the catalog for his retrospective. So his very first mural commission was 1960. So this is the same year as the Big Bad Wolf mural was created on Pennsylvania Avenue. So this is at USF. USF is a new school like UCF. There's all these mid-century buildings, and they all want to have murals. So this one is called Forum 1, and it's on either side of the administration building, and there's 2 murals actually. And this is a detail. There's one here, and then there's an opening, and then there's one on the other side. So he worked with Mexican tile workers. He went down to Mexico for about 6 weeks, and they did the installation. They cut the tile. He did this large, they call it a cartoon, which was the design of it, and fixed the colors, but they actually did the installation. It was a company called Dow Tile. The same year, he got another commission for a different building. This is the Chemistry Administration building, where he tried a completely different technique, not mosaic. He tried working with different colored aggregates. So you can see what's going on here. This is a lot more similar to the Winter Park Post Office. He's trying different things, and it reminds me a lot of this building. You can see that, you know, the concrete here and the aggregate outside. There's a lot of similarity between what Joe Testaseca did and the exterior and the textures of this building. So it was built in 1965, and this is an archival image. You can see the colors have shifted. My favorite story is, I'm here to embarrass my sister-in-law again. They brought 4th grade students from Brookshire Elementary to give their opinion of it, and my sister-in-law happened to be one of those, and she said she saw a pet snake with one eye and a mouth somewhere in this mess of things. But today it's really hurting. You can see there's big gaps where the aggregate's falling out, and the colors have faded badly. I think one of the things I learned is that people have mixed feelings of the value of the style of this artwork. It's not as beloved as some of the more conservative, conventional, representational artwork, but I think it's very important just because the artist is so important. He did a similar mural that's very much like the one in Winter Park, but it had little insets that were ceramic, you can see here. It's called Symbols of Mankind. It was built in 1969, so that's 4 years after this is on a library building in Ybor City. It was starting to fall apart in 1995, so it was painstakingly restored. And then they took it off the building, knocked the building down, and put it on the new building in 2014. So that's how much he's revered in the Tampa Bay area. So the last 2 murals are more modern. So the way they fit together is lovely. And it's the Community Pride in Hannibal Square mosaic. And what's lovely about this mural is it's not the work of one single individual. It's maybe as many as 500. Different people did different things. You know, that they used commercial tiles, so there were people who could break up the commercial tiles into smaller pieces. They made their own tiles out of clay, so people could make the tiles. After they were fired, some people could glaze them, and then there was assembling the whole piece. So it really involves the community mural. And there's 3 people who were largely responsible for the creation of this mural. Peter Schreier, who was in charge of Crealdi at the time. Lynn Tomlinson, who kind of did their public projects. She did actually 4 murals in Winter Park. And Fairlyn Livingston, who is a rock star historian who did so much work on Hannibal Square. And I learned much of what I know about Hannibal Square because of Fairlyn's work. And it's a lovely photo from Rollins of Fairlyn there in front of the mural. So the story that's told there, a little bit about the process too, is Lynn Tomlinson and Fairland would go into elementary schools and tell the story of how Hannibal Square evolved. And the story is that Chapman and Chase set apart, it was very curated at the time, which is another theme, an area for African American workforce on the other side of the railroad tracks called Hannibal Square. And when they decided to incorporate the town, it was controversial whether that should be included in the town. So there was one side that wanted to include it, and they needed those votes, and there was opposition. And so in order to become incorporated, this gentleman right here, Gus Henderson, who is a newspaperman, he's holding his newspaper right here, led the African American community to cross the railroad tracks to vote for incorporation and got them over the threshold they needed to vote for it. And two gentlemen who may or may not be these gentlemen next to Gus Henderson, I hope that they are, named Simpson and Israel, became black aldermen in Winter Park. And it's a very important story in Winter Park history. Fairland did a lot of incredible research on that, and that's the story that was told to the elementary school. So then they would tell them the story, and they would write down the ideas, how do you represent that? And that's how they came up with the artwork. So the kids were involved. The important thing to know about Hannibal Square is that it was a thriving community. It was independent, it had everything you needed. You didn't need to leave the neighborhood because you weren't allowed to leave the neighborhood if you were African American. This quote says it had undertakers, everything you needed to survive, and did very well. But after World War II, well, one more thing, between World War I and World War II, during the Depression, the population of Hannibal Square actually grew. It was that thriving of a community. But after World War II, things started to shift. A lot of the people who were in the military came back, and they didn't want to do the kind of jobs that were available in Winter Park. And then the second and third generation of people who originally settled in Hannibal Square started to go to college, and they wanted more professional jobs, and none of those were available for African Americans at that time in Winter Park. So things start shifting, and the narratives by the late 90s and the early 2000s, the narrative in the newspapers as portrayed of Hannibal Square is one of a very different neighborhood. The paper in 1990 says the West Side consisted of boarded up buildings, few businesses, and the lowest percentage of owner-occupied homes in the city. And so that's kind of what they focused on in the press. So in 1991, the city of Winter Park approved the creation of a community redevelopment agency, which we call a CRA. The CRA focused on two areas, the west side of Winter Park and downtown. So the CRA is generally a tool which uses taxes to try and keep local tax money local to work on projects where there's blight. So they considered the Hannibal Square neighborhood in the west side blighted, and they considered the parking blight and along Park Avenue. And those were originally the two areas by the CRA. So just a few years later, 9 years later, this was Florida Magazine, which was in the Sentinel. It talks about the gentrification that's starting to occur there. So there's two contrasting things. You know, it opens with this story. A black neighborhood steeped in history is turning into a place for chic bars and fancy homes thanks to one powerful developer. But then the piece also acknowledges concerns that the whole project is just a thinly disguised land grab, a chance to transform the neighborhood into Park Avenue West and gradually crowd out all the old residents. I did an oral history with city planner Jeff Briggs, and he said there was a waterfall of gentrification. One of the things that happened to try and counteract that was in 1971, the city built a community center on the west side, and when Creole was starting to get involved, they created this mural back here in Shady Park facing east on the community center, which is somewhat similar to the one, the mosaic that would come later. Peter Schreier started to document do photographic projects throughout it to preserve the history, and then Fairland did her work, which shined even more light on the history. And eventually the Hannibal Square Heritage Center opened up, I think in 2007. And then they decided that they needed a better mural, a more permanent mural, and mosaic is perfect for that because it lasts longer in the Florida weather. And the aspect of the community being involved is so wonderful. So Lynn Tomlinson, he was in charge of projects like this for Creole at the time, enlisted people. Farrellyn, is this you? Yes. I thought it was, and I know this is Dina Mack here, who's a local artist. You can see they cut the lead type out of clay, and they're installing it. So they installed it, and knowing full well that that building would likely be demolished, on panels. So it went up initially, I think, I'll show you in a minute. Oh, so here's a very cool story though. Farrellyn told a story about, and maybe she'll tell you later, about making dolls out of bottles. So this is a representation of Farrellyn right here in the mosaic. So one of the things I love most about this mural is not just the style of the artwork, but it works so well on different levels. Like, you can get these wonderful close-ups that you can frame, and they're like perfect little pictures, and then you can get far away and take it all in at once, and it tells this wonderful narrative. And then what I also love is the use of mirrors, because if the sky is blue, it's this brilliant blue outline, but if it's overcast, it's this white outline, so it changes every time you see it. It's a wonderful piece of art. It's got this kind of folk art quality that I love, and it tells a very important story in Winter Park history. So this was it when it was originally, this is the old community center in 2007. When they built the new community center, it lived in Lynn Tomlinson's garage. They took the individual panels off. So you can see how there's kind of squares. So it's very smart what they did so they could take it apart and put it back. Okay, so I originally, when I submitted my grant proposal, didn't have the Depew Nursing Home Center because I was worried about painted murals because a lot of times they're ephemeral and they don't last. So the ones we see as we're driving into town on the side of businesses, the business change and it's painted over. So I was urged to do it because I think people knew what was going to happen to the Depew Nursing Home, and it was going to be knocked down. And it was the best thing that could have happened. I kept having these great strokes of luck, and including this was very exciting to me because I learned so much about Mary Lee Depew that I'm very excited about. Another one of the up there is Kim Mold. She did a Smith Grant talk about the two women's clubs in town, the Ideal Women's Club in Hannibal Square and the Winter Park Women's Club, and looked at the history of Mary Lee Depew. Not a lot is known about Mary Lee Depew, or was known before she arrived in Orlando in 1939, but we were able to find out some great stuff. We know that her maiden name was Wallace, and it was she went by Juanita as her middle name, and most of the stuff I found before she moved to Orlando. No evidence of that once she got to Florida. She was a well-respected teacher in St. Louis, Missouri, till she got married. I think it was just her and the principal at this black school, but very well regarded. The 1910 census lists her as a maid. She got married to Baker, who went to Fisk University. I'm not sure he graduated, but if you've heard of the Fisk Singers, you know how important that is. Baker was very important. He was a postman, and he actually ran for alderman in Evanston. Didn't win, but a few elections later, there was a black representative elected in Evanston. We know that she had a child that did not live in 1910. When she got married in 1903, the article in the St. Louis newspaper called them black aristocracy. So we knew they had quite a life before they ever got to Florida, both of them. So this was my favorite thing I learned. In 1927, Mary McLeod Bethune, the civil rights leader, was doing speeches in Chicago, and they entertained Mary McLeod Bethune in their home, which was like the biggest thing I think I discovered in this whole thing. They were kind of rock stars. She was involved with the women's club, the Matilda, what is it again? Dunbar Club, and she was the president. And so they were both involved with the church. I think they met through the church because Baker's father was a minister in Alton, Illinois, which is just the other side of the Mississippi River from St. Louis. But they were coming back and forth between Florida and Evanston all the time for at least a decade, because they would stop in Birmingham and see Mary Lee's sister, who was a nurse trained at the Tuskegee Institute. So on the 1930 census, and I was worried about this at first because they misspelled Depew, but she's listed with her and her husband and the Crafts, George and Maud Craft, who they worked with when they got here. So it's likely they were snowbirds going back and forth for many years before they moved here permanently. And so what happened is George Craft, who was their employer, died in 1937, and that's when Baker and Mary Lee moved here permanently. This is from Kim Smith grant work that's in the archives. And so this is George Craft. He made clothing, he owned stores, he basically almost worked himself to death because he wouldn't sleep, and so then he kind of retired to Evanston, and then he came to Florida, had a home down here, and retired to Winter Park, but he actually owned a bank and was involved, he was a city councilman, so he never seemed to ever really retire for sure. And this is his wife Maud. They had a house on Lake Osceola by the Seminole Hotel. A very, very nice house. They entertained with all the Irving Bachelor and Hamilton Holt and all those people were coming to their house all the time. So Kim theorizes or has heard that the relationship between Mary Lee and Maud Craft was more than just employer-employee relationships. And I think that's what I got excited about learning all this stuff before her life in Florida, because she was a rock star before she ever got here. She was 70 years old when she moved here in 1939, and she did all these great things in the community, but she had already done great things in Evanston, Illinois. So the main thing she's known for is starting the Ideal Women's Club. When she originally got here, she was horrified by the lack of facilities for the African Americans living on the west side. She went to a play, and there were no props, and there were no anything. And she had come from this background of women's clubs that were able to provide those kind of things in the Midwest. So she and Maud, who was a member of the Winter Park Women's Club, decided I'm jumping ahead. So she started the Ideal Women's Club, and eventually they needed a headquarters for that. So 4 years later, the Congregational Church was building a new building, and they were going to get rid of this old wooden building. They called it Hooker Hall, after the Reverend Hooker, who was one of the founders of Rollins College and the Congregationalist Church. So they did a fundraiser. I think Kim theorizes that most of the money was provided by Mrs. Craft herself, because she gave $500 to move this building. And it was moved over here on the west side. And ironically enough, when this building was threatened with demolition, that's when Fairland and Livingston got involved with all her advocacy for Winter Park history. But this building was the center of the universe for women on the west side for years and years and years. It was very important. And what grew out of that was that Mary Lee recognized one of the biggest needs in the community was health care for African Americans. And so first they did a little small 4-room clinic, but sadly Mary Lee died in 1949. So she had moved here at 70 and died at 82, but the plans went on, and eventually that clinic morphed into a nursing home, and which was always the idea. They had established a committee called the Benevolent Committee, which was a kind of fundraising mechanism for the Ideal Women's Club. So this is a postcard of the original Depew nursing home, supported by both the black and white communities. And one of the things I learned in this is that, again, the community really supports the things that matter, again and again and again. And one of the fun things to learn is one of the early supporters in the fundraiser to build this place was Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. He was involved with helping to raise funds for the Depew nursing home. So it expanded and grew. It had gardens out back. It was a full-size nursing home. At some point, they decided they wanted a mural. So this gentleman sitting right here, Al I just call him Al. He painted his name on it, so I was able to track him down through Facebook. They had an artist sitting at the front desk who could handle this very well. So Al, ironically, grew up in the town of Ocklawaha, the same place that Joy Postal lived when she moved to Florida, which is, if you've been to Ocklawaha, there's not much there, which is a remarkable thing. He was an educator for 30 years, but had this great art background from UF and UCF, and was always doing art. He had done several murals on the inside of schoolhouses, and had been in shows and in galleries. But he retired from teaching after 30 years. God bless you. I know what that's like. My wife's a teacher. And was working as front desk manager when they needed a mural, and they had this great rock star artist sitting there at the front desk. So here's some of his work. You can see this, I love this bird. Again, it's that whole joy postal energy again, and this beautiful watercolor. And I think artists are compelled to create, even no matter what you do in life. And I think Al always had that desire to keep creating, no matter what he was doing for a living. And the difference, when you're an artist and you don't have to depend on your art to make a living, it frees you up in a little way. That's my own personal experience. So the great thing is Al is a meticulous record keeper. So he had a binder on the creation of the mural with his original sketches and the paint swatches. So he used just regular house paints, and I think they flopped, right? Didn't you flop these two eventually? No, this is it. So I call it one mural, but it's really two because it's separated by this. I think we all probably remember driving by this wonderful mural. I think the butterfly motif is perfect because it's renewal, this wasn't really about self-expression for Al. This is really about connecting with the residents. And he has a lot of pictures of them either on the kind of the faux swing or in front of the butterfly that really shows how well it worked. And it's a loss that we don't have it anymore. The other connection that I really like is this is craft azalea gardens, so that then you have a connection to the crafts again that kind of pays light to the work of Mary Lee Depew. This was more than a work of art. I think this symbolizes all the great work that went inside, all the great work that Mary Lee Depew did. In September 2025, the Sentinel reported the board of directors of the gardens at Depew Nursing Center, believed to be one of the first nursing homes for Black people in the state, decided it was time to close the nearly 70-year-old institution. The facility, which earned accolades for its high level of care, was hard hit by the pandemic and skyrocketing costs in the healthcare industry. Demolition started just in February. In this way, the mural was more than a work of art, but a beautiful symbol of the lives of those who lived in the building. Oh, I said that already. As the neighborhood of Winter Park's west side continues to change, those stories take on additional importance. While the architecture of the gardens at Depew Nursing Home was not considered significant, the institution was an enduring symbol of Winter Park's commitment to take care of all the members of the community. And I see that in all this, that the importance of the community, the importance of maintaining heritage. And I believe that Winter Park believes in maintaining its heritage. The mural represented an outward manifestation of the good work going on inside the building and a reminder of Mary Depew's legacy in Winter Park. I do, however, have concerns about the future of the post office murals, and they could face the same fate. But in Winter Park, there's always a choice. The perfect vehicle for examining the ephemerality of murals is, in fact, that they can go away very, very easily. Should the opportunity arise to preserve the Winter Park post office murals, it may simply come down to the will of Winter Parkers to preserve it. Jeff Briggs gave me this great quote: in Winter Park, you can do anything you want to. If the citizens want to make something happen, they will. If they don't, it won't. One of the things I've learned is that in Winter Park, when there's a will, there's a way. If the public is behind something, they will get out their checkbooks to invest in their community. I mean, how many communities would cut a house in half, truck it across the lake on a barge, and put it back together? And then, then there's Casa Feliz, there's tons of great stories. So the other thing I notice is there's a tension in Winter Park between those wanting to preserve things and those that are okay building something new and maybe putting up a sign or a marker or interpretive display talking about what used to be there. I think most times that there's a middle ground where people tend to meet, but as the city grows, I think we have to make decisions as to how we become a more modern city and how we honor our past. By choosing to preserve historic landscape along with modernization, Winter Parkers have the opportunity to show that they value the town's heritage as much as progress. Winter Park's aesthetics are carefully curated and have been from Chapman and Chase. Historic resources, in particular those surviving murals, function as a visual record documenting historical values, economic priorities, and aesthetic ideals across time. Together, these elements from the past show that Winter Park's aesthetic character is not accidental, but cultivated a complex story defined by the thoughtful respect for place and the people who have lived here. So, that's my report. It turned into a book. I had no intentions of making it into a book. When I got my first draft proof, I realized there was a number of typos because in addition to writing this, I had to typeset it and design it. And so I realized it needed another round of proofing. So in order to have something available today, I have the draft proofs. But if you want the finished edition that's typo-free, hopefully, you can buy those and they should arrive next week and I'll mail them to you signed. But I just thank you again for this honor and this opportunity to talk here. And hopefully I've contributed to the scholarship that's been done with the Smith Grant because there are big shoes to fill in that room next door in the archives. And it's an incredible resource. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.